Greetings and welcome back to Room 303, AP English, our World of Ideas lectures. We are in unit number 8, Poetics. We are now at the end of Jacobus. This is lecture 50, Susan Sontag's Against Interpretation, her 1966 offering. And this is in fact the last of our essays of study in the Jacobus volume. It is ironic that now we come to a text on hermeneutics, interpretation, since, if you'll think about it, we've been arguing the whole time we've been studying together in 303 that we are the stories we tell, the stories we retell, the stories we accept, the stories that we reject. But we don't reject a story until we know the story, right? That is to say, that's foolishness to reject a story without knowing the story. Sontag is going to be such an important voice for us. And now coming at the end, after our study of Virginia Woolf, is something really right about ending our time together in the World of Ideas with the great Susan Sontag. Now, our assumptions are that you have been following our stuff at learnstrong.net through lectures 49, because I'm going to reference some of that. I feel like we have to, right, at the end. And as well, our assumption is that you're familiar with our learning theory, connecting new information to old information in meaningful, and that in meaningful ways, Sontag was such a voice and advocate for. You got to find information that moves you, that means something to you, right? We do that, of course, in our reading through active reading, annotation as we call it. Level 1, we answer the question, what does this text say? Level 2, what does it mean? Of course, we're interested as well in rhetoric at that point. And then finally at level 3, how can I relate to this information in some meaningful way? I also hope that you are growing as a reader through our study of the World of Ideas, and that you pick up this essay now and read on your own and then use me for help. Let's do some brief biography here and use Jacobus's prose to help us. The dates, 1933 to 2004, the great American writer Susan Sontag, filmmaker, philosopher, teacher. She was a political activist as well. She wrote mostly essays, although she did write other kinds of things as well, but really one of the most influential critics of her time and generation. Degrees from the University of Chicago and Harvard as well, academically trained, but she had this amazing capacity, you're going to see this in this essay, to write at a very, very simple level, to produce and share complicated ideas. Just to hear what Jacobus has to say about her on 752. He says, Against Interpretation, the text we're about to look at, in many ways is a reaction to an age in which all literature must submit to commentary and interpretation. In this essay, Sontag makes an effort to assess exactly what interpretation is. Of course, all of this borrowed heavily from the tradition of Friedrich Nietzsche, right, who is the first great real, I said first, okay, truly Plato was the first great, but Socrates, Plato, but ultimately it was Nietzsche that pointed out what today is almost like the air we breathe. Interpretation is everything, and yet if it's everything, it's nothing. And so how can you ever define what an interpretation is that's legit? Sontag will make an effort to assess exactly what interpretation is. The task of interpretation, quote, she says, is virtually one of translation. The interpreter says, look, don't you see that X is really, or really means A, that is, Y is really B, that Z is really C, paragraph 11, end quote. She believes that interpretation is not only an intermediary for literature and film, but that it substitutes for them and tames them. As she says, quote, one tames the work of art, interpretation makes art manageable, comfortable, paragraph 18, or as we call it in Room 18, or in 303, we call it owning the text, right? Making it your own, right? She is quick to admit, Sontag, that during some ages interpretation is a positive force, but she believes that in other ages, such as the present one, it is not. And we, of course, know the degrees to which she was prophetic on this count. Early in the essay, Sontag distinguishes between form and content. She focuses on literature and film, though she's obviously referring to all mimetic art. As Aristotle tells us in Poetics, drama is the imitation of an action and is therefore mimetic. Although the word mimetic does not appear in the translation from the Poetics included in this book, in Jacobus. In the rest of the Poetics, it's a key term that links drama with life. Sontag explains that if art is mimetic, it therefore has a content that relates it to life, and that is interpretable. Her complaint is not just that commentators separate the form of a work of art from its content, but that the act of interpretation concentrates on content to the exclusion of form, or virtually so. A couple of lines later, Jacobus continues, Sontag urges us to discontinue our emphasis on content and to restore attention to form. She believes that film is the most vital current art. And she reminds us that modern films, and she's thinking of those by artistic filmmakers, not those by commercial entertainers, are interesting largely by virtue of their visual form, by those elements that transcend content. In essence, she's conceiving a poetics of film based on attention to its formal cinematic qualities. And of course, as we have pointed out, when you look at a text, a great work of film. We in 303 we love Steve Spielberg's Color Purple, for example. There are scenes of that film we have argued bring music and the visual arts together in such stunning fashion, right? Jacobus will finish by pointing out, Sontag ends her essay by making an appeal for a critical approach that does not interpret but that examines and reports back on the facts, the perceptual elements of the work of art. She calls this, quote, an erotics of art, end quote, because it emphasizes a growing awareness of sensory experience. And we're back to Wordsworth, of course, in Lyrical Ballads. She feels that sensory experience is important because the act of interpretation emphasizes intellectualization at the expense of experience. Thus, she says, quote, we must learn to see more, to hear more, to feel more. Paragraph 40, sounding, of course, very much like Virginia Woolf in Letter to a Young Poet. Now, let's talk real quickly about rhetoric here. It is an argument. She does work with defining terms and logical presentation, and as well, we should point out that she does take into consideration the historical perspective, as we talked about in our lecture on Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Let's work through the 43 paragraphs quickly in our level 1 summarizing. She begins by saying, art began as magical, an instrument of ritual. The Greek philosophers characterized it as an imitation of reality, and obviously we're thinking Aristotle, right? This mimic theory challenges art to justify itself. Plato, seeing art as an imitation of an imitation, considered it neither useful nor true. That's Book 10 of Republic, and we've given lectures on that at Learn Strong, right? Aristotle believed art is useful as therapy, a purge of dangerous emotions, right? That purgation catharsis thing, and obviously we studied that several times in 303, right? Paragraphs 4 through 6. The defense of art as a representation of reality has led to a separation of form from content. Content being essential in form, kind of an accessory, right? This remains the case even when art is viewed as subjective expression, a statement of the artist rather than a picture of reality. Paragraph 7 through 11. We can't return, she says, to the innocence of simply experiencing art, but are permanently committed to defining it and defending it, right? The concept of content has become a nuisance, giving rise to interpretation, which conversely sustains the idea that art is content. Interpretation means plucking a set of elements from the whole work and translating them. X really means A, and so on. Paragraphs 12 through 13. Interpretation came into being when science broke the power of myth. The differentiation of the value spheres, as we say in the lecture on the scientific enlightenment, go back and take a look at that one again, right? And the seemliness of religious symbols was questioned. Interpretation reconciled the ancient and often coarse or unbelievable texts, we think of Nietzsche, with the demands of later readers. In our own more arrogant era, interpretation follows Marx and Freud in seeking the hidden meaning assumed to lie beneath the overt one. Paragraphs 14 through 18. The interpretation itself must be evaluated. In some cultural contexts, it is a means of liberation from the dead past. In others, including our own, it's reactionary and stifling. Interpretation improves what really exists by setting up a shadow world of meanings. We have to think about Plato's cave allegory in our lecture there, right? Quote, she says, never trust the teller, says D.H. Lawrence, right? Trust the tale, end quote. Driven by a wish to replace the work by something else, interpretation violates the work and turns it into an article for use. And of course, Lawrence's work for us is hypercritical and important. Go back to Learn Strong and take a look at our comments on Rocking Horse Winter, right? Paragraphs 27-29. A great deal of today's art represents a backlash against interpretation into parody, abstraction, decorative art, and non-art. We even think about Tom Stoppart's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead, a really important text about interpretation and hermeneutics in 303, right? Abstract painting, she says, is an attempt to have no content and hence no interpretation. In pop art, the content is so blatant as to be uninterpretable. Much of modern poetry also has escaped. We think about maybe the work of T.S. Eliot as being the beginning of that movement. Paragraphs 30 through 32. Interpretation, she says, runs rampant in those American arts with a feeble and negligible avant-garde fiction and the drama. The author's uninspired use of form has overexposed their content. We think of Kerouac's On the Road as an attempt to try to answer something like this, right? Experiments with form are one defense against interpretation. Another is making unified, direct, fast-moving works. Film, which sometimes accomplishes this, is therefore the most vital art form today. Of course, she was commenting today, she might even go further and say it's no longer film, it's probably music videos and video games, right? Film has the advantage of having only recently entered art from mass culture and also the diverse vocabulary of forms, no question. Paragraphs 33 to 43 to finish. To serve the work of art rather than usurp it. Criticism should pay more attention to form, becoming descriptive instead of prescriptive or interpretive. We need to experience art as it is to see, hear, and feel more. Criticism should show how the work is that it is, or even that it is what it is, and not show what it means. This is why, for example, in our reading theory, we begin at level 1, what does the text say? And then move to what does it mean and how can we relate to it. Since we're there, let's now work this essay at the second level 2A, our big 5. Epistemologically, what we can know, what's this text arguing? Well, often this is going to sound almost like a relativist kind of rendering, but as we have said about a number of other thinkers like Nietzsche in our conversation of Apollonian Dionysianism, I don't think it is relativism. I just think that it is a suggestion to move from the absolutist position to a more fallibilist position when one is interpreting. I think I'm right, but I could be wrong. Of course, her essay itself is a certain kind of interpretation as well, isn't it? Ontologically, that is to say, who are we? Well, obviously we are creatures of interpretation, and yet that interpretation can paralyze us, right? We think about the story of the Buddha, his word picture, you're shot in the leg by a poisoned arrow, but before somebody can pull it out and get the poison out, you need to know everything about the arrow. How is it made? The fletching, the wood, where did it all come from? What was the motives for the shooter to shoot me? And of course, in the meantime, you're dying of the poison. The Buddha says, take out the arrow and then you can start to assess later. And of course, Sontag's argument would be somewhat of the same. Psychologically, of course, that's the point. Fear can, in fact, inhibit our freedom to interpret. And, of course, sociologically, interpretation is going to be the basis upon which we build respect. It's got to be given to multiple forms of interpretation. We, of course, live in a time where the absolutist positions epistemologically have now taken over again with ideologies. Our challenge is to hear what Sontag, from Plato to Nietzsche to Sontag, have to say about valuing others' opinions even though we don't necessarily agree with them at all, right? What does this text say about theodicy? Well, obviously suffering is often the product of poor interpretation, and we learned this from our study of Milton, didn't we? At 2A, messages, art is always evolving, and experience art as it is. That is to say, try to feel more in the moment with the art. We've obviously invited you to do this by finding the writers and the thinkers that move you. At 2B, obviously notice the clear and concise argument here that's quite beautifully written. I'm so happy this is the last essay in the World of Ideas volume that we study. At 3A, all the writers, of course, that we have studied, from Plato to Aristotle to end with T.S. Eliot and Kafka. I mean, think about Kafka and Metamorphoses. I mean, go and take a look at our lecture there. And think about how that is really just a text about interpretation, isn't it? At 3B, finally, why do you think it is sometimes so hard to experience art? What is it that gets in the way, right? And for you, what's a time when it happened for you and you were able to break through and you got it, and then other times not so much? Some of you reporting, when I read Plato's Cave Allegory, it didn't move me. When I heard how you were interpreting it, then it started to move me in some profound way. Why is that, though? Well, okay, we finish. And our final question, it has to be the last one, right? Of all of the texts that we read now, the 41 texts of the 50 lectures of World of Ideas, for you, the one that most moved you, the one that most compelled you, was it in fact Plato? Was it Machiavelli? Was it Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail? Was it the Virginia Woolf suggestion to a young poet or artist? What is it for you and why? And then finally, if we are the stories that we tell and retell, the stories we accept and reject, what is your story? Who are you? I think it's time for us to maybe ask that question legitimately. For the rest of your life, we would hope. Thank you for your kind attendance through these 50 lectures.